Oh, hey. I was just pretending to do laundry. Between you and me, I'm not even quite sure how this whole thing works. Anyways, last time we were in here, we were working on the cabinets for the laundry room. Now, we showed you this whole section over here. We built those, got those installed. We ripped out all the old 90s cabinets, put up shiplap. What I didn't show you was the work we did over here above the washer and dryer. We're gonna build a nice little cabinet surround to make it look pretty. And on top of that, we're gonna do some butcher block countertops. We get so many questions about butcher block countertops, it's not even funny. People are wanting to know, what type of wood should your butcher blocks be made out of? What should you finish your butcher blocks with? How do you cut and install butcher blocks? What's the best way to hook the butcher blocks to the countertops? What kind of things do you do if you have two pieces of butcher block coming together in a corner? Should you butt joint it? Should you miter joint it? What do you do? What do you do? I don't know. So we thought, well, let's just make a video on how to install them. So that's exactly what this video is going to be about. So follow along, see how we do it. Check out the video description down below for links to products and tools and supplies and all that stuff. There's a link to our website where you can get some sweet new merchandise. There's a link to our Patreon account where you can get a bunch of behind the scenes footage and all that stuff. So check that out and watch the video. All right? I think these things are done. So the first question you have to answer when it comes to butcher blocks is, what type of wood do you want to use for your butcher block countertops? Now, there are woods I would recommend and there are definitely woods I would steer clear of. Now, the woods that are okay to use for butcher block are going to be your classic cabinet woods like walnut, white oak, maple. You could even use cherry. Birch would probably be acceptable, although it's a little on the softer side. Things I would steer clear from are your softer woods like poplar, pine, fir. Things that are going to have a lot more seasonal movement, a lot more voids and knots, and they're going to be really soft and ding and not wear as well. For our butcher blocks, I think I'm going to go with white oak because we have white oak in other places in our house. White oak stands up really well to moisture. That's why they typically build boats out of it. So I think all in all, it'll be a pretty good butcher block countertop. So now all I got to do is start ripping up some white oak and gluing it back together. I'm going to give you the basic professional tips for making your own butcher block. First thing you're going to want to do is pick what width you want to rip your boards to. This is about 1.25 inches. Then I take a nice piece of white oak, I run it through the table saw so I got a good long strip of 1.25 inch wide wood. Then you're going to take that piece, make sure it looks pretty good, then hold it in front of you and whack yourself in the flippin' face because you should not build your own butcher blocks. You can order them on IKEA. $249 for a walnut veneered butcher block? I mean, that's hard to beat. Believe me, I know you think I'm joking, but making your own butcher blocks is a total waste of time and pain in the butt. There's just so much cutting and gluing and it's hard to get all the pieces straight. It really takes a professional setup to glue together butcher blocks and do it well. If you don't want to order them on IKEA, well, there's a bunch of other websites, or you can actually get some butcher blocks just at your big box store. That's right. This may be the one and only time I'm telling you to buy wood at Home Depot, but not that piece. That piece is ugly. You see, you can pick from a bunch of different varieties, you can get different sizes, thicknesses, and the prices, well, you're not going to be able to make your own butcher block for that cheap. Look, they even have these giant pieces of birch butcher block that you can use for your kitchen island. I'm telling you, there is no shame in just buying pre-made butcher block. Now let's get the heck out of here before I accidentally buy a bunch of pine. See ya. Now let's say you can't find the right sizes at the big box store or online. Another option is to find a local supplier that you can custom order butcher block through, built to your specifications, which is exactly what we're going to do for our project. I got these at the Hardwood Center. They were very accommodating and they got me exactly the right sizes that I needed. So with our butcher blocks already made by someone else, which is the way it should be, it's time to take our measurements and start cutting our pieces to fit on top of our cabinets. Now I didn't show you in the last video, but I built this nice surround above our washer and dryer so we can put a big old slab of butcher block on top.
So I grabbed said slab of butcher block, which is not light, by the way, and carried it over to my work table. Now I did check to see if there was a top or bottom to these, but since they surfaced both sides, they actually look pretty good on either side, so it didn't really matter. Next, I got out the track saw with my little square cutting jig thing from Woodpeckers, and I cut a nice square edge along one side. Then I rotated the entire thing around and I cut it to length. This one's pretty easy because it's just a big rectangle that's going on top of the washer and dryer. So after measuring my length with the tape measure, I don't feel like I needed to tell you that part. Obviously, I'm measuring it with a tape measure. What else am I going to measure it with? Spaghetti noodles? I don't know. Anyways, I grabbed my little square track saw guide thing again and I cut it to its final length. And yes, I do not have a dust bag on my track saw. I did that on purpose so you will be thoroughly annoyed throughout this video every time you see dust flying all over my shop. I just like messing with you that way. With my butcher block cut to the right length, it was time to cut it to the right width or depth. One of the two. Now I wanted to cut the material off the back side because it is going to leave this little thin strip of butcher block, and well, if it's at the back, you're not going to be staring at it. I wanted to leave the front, nice and, well, full width like. I did notice while I was cutting this piece down that one of the seams wasn't quite glued together, which is annoying but should be pretty easy to fix. I tried to shove a chisel in there at first to kind of spread the crack open so I could get some glue in there, but I was afraid the chisel was going to mar up the edge. So then I took some scrap pieces of wood and some CA glue and I glued some pieces on to act as clamping cauls so I could get a clamp in there and spread that crack apart. Then I put a clamp in there and I spread the crack apart. I really should wait to tell you what I'm doing until I'm actually doing it on screen. Anyways, with that crack spread open a little bit, I squirted some glue on the top and then I tried to use the classic trick of the dust extractor underneath to pull the glue into that crack, and I couldn't really tell if it was working or not. So then I used another method, which is just to take a thin piece of paper and kind of use it as dental floss and just work it into that crack. The paper will naturally pull some of the glue into the crack with the paper, and you should get a sufficient amount of glue in there to clamp the whole thing back together. Kind of like this. Then all I had to do was pop off those temporary clamping cauls. The CA glue is nice because it doesn't usually pull off any of the grain and mess up your work surface. Then I just slapped a clamp on there, make sure you get some nice squeeze out in the crack, which I did, and wait for it to dry. A few hours later, or the next day in this case, I took the clamp off and now everything was nice and stabilized and I could keep on trucking. Now for the top of the washer and dryer butcher block, I have to cut out a little access hole in the back right corner so that I can get to the water valves in case I ever need to disconnect them or turn them off in a hurry. So I just gotta cut out this little section towards the back. How badly do you want to hook a dust extractor up to that track saw right now? Am I right? Now you might be asking, isn't that going to be really ugly to have a giant hole on the back section of your butcher block countertop? But that's because you don't have the final vision in your mind of what everything's going to look like. There's eventually going to be upper cabinets set on top of this butcher block, and I can hide that access panel inside one of the cabinets so you'll never even know it's there. With everything cut to the right size and shape, we carried the butcher block back into the laundry room just to test and make sure it fit, which I'm happy to report it did. That's also why there's only part of a wall of shiplap on the left-hand side because, again, the cabinets will cover it all up. So with the easy section of butcher block cut to size, it was time to move on to the more complicated sections, this long L-shaped section of countertop. I measured one section of the countertop and then went back into the shop to make a template out of 3/4 inch plywood. So I carried a piece of 3/4 inch birch ply over to the table saw and I cut it to the depth that I want my finished countertop to be. In this case, it is right at 24 1/8 inch deep. Next, I used a T-square to mark out the length of my countertop and I cut it to length with the handy dandy track saw. Zip, zap, zoop. Now, a question we get a lot is what to do in a corner when installing butcher block countertops. Should you do a butt joint or a giant miter? My answer is always a giant miter, because it's more complicated, and why not torture yourself a little bit? I'm kidding. It's really not that much harder, and it looks way nicer because the grain naturally changes direction at the corner instead of this harsh line. So mitered it is. I used a little angled square thingamabob to get my 45-degree angle, and then I continued it on with the track saw and then excessively marked out the section I needed to cut off. Then using the track saw on my line, I cut that angle, and we were ready to haul this piece back into the laundry room and test to see how it fit. Darn it, I did it again. I told you what was happening before it actually happened. So then we hauled the piece into the laundry room to test to see if it fit. As redundant as that might seem now. I was really hoping I wouldn't have to scribe the back of this piece of plywood, but of course it needed a little bit of scribe work. So I just drew my scribe line with a mechanical pencil, and it was small enough I could just cut to that scribe line with the hand sander. So that's what I did. Next, we had to figure out the cutout for our undermount farmhouse sink. Now, the best way to figure out the shape of your farmhouse sink is to just roughly cut out the opening for the sink. I mean, bring it in a good 2 inches from both sides and from the back. So I just marked with my pencil on either side, and then I slid the tape measure underneath to find the depth, and I brought that measurement in a good, 2 inches, as I mentioned, and then we'll haul this back into the shop and roughly cut out that shape. Man, I keep on doing it, telling you what's happening before it happens. I'm not even going to tell you what I'm doing here, because I already told you, so you're just going to have to guess if you weren't paying attention. So, how do you like them apples? Anyways, with my rough shape of the sink cut out using a combination of the track saw and the jigsaw, then we can carry this piece back into the laundry room, set it on top of our counter, make sure it's exactly where we want it, and now using a pencil, we can scribe the inside shape of the sink by just running that pencil along the inside shape of the sink. Just make sure you go nice and slow, keep firm pressure against the edge of the sink so you get a nice consistent line. I like to do this 3 or 4 times so that if one of my lines is off, at least I have a pretty good consistent mark of where I need to cut. With the sink marked out, it's back into the shop to make our final cut to fit the sink. Because we're going to be using this plywood as our template to cut our finished countertops, we want to make sure this cut is super accurate. So I'm not just going to use the jigsaw and follow my pencil line. Instead, I'm going to use the router and try and get it as perfect as I possibly can. So using some scrap pieces of plywood and some double-sided tape, I stick the plywood on my pencil line all the way along. I've essentially created a router template that we can use to cut out with, you guessed it, the router. I'm going to be using this bad boy compression bit from Bits and Bits with this bottom and top mounted bearing, although we're only using the top mounted bearing in this scenario. And then all I got to do is zip zap zoop it around the entire perimeter, and boom. We should be in business, and this should match the overall shape of our sink. I think. Nah, that rhymed. Silly Jason. Then, as if I hadn't got enough steps in today already, I pulled off my temporary template and carried the entire thing back into the laundry room one last time to make sure it fit. And would you look at that? It's almost like we know what we're doing. Even though we really don't. We're just kind of making it up. But hey, it worked pretty good. Look at that. I will round over these harsh corners before we do our final cutout. But for now, we can start working on our other piece of the L-shaped countertop. I'm going to do this in 2 sections because there's no reason to fight a giant piece. So I start by cutting the piece that's got the 45-degree angle on it, and you'll notice there's going to be a pretty significant gap towards the back of the template against the wall. I did that on purpose because, again, there's going to be cabinets set on top of this countertop, and I just didn't see why I needed to make it super tight and be fighting the wall the entire time. So don't think I measured wrong. I did that on purpose. Then with my section with the 45-degree angle cut and finished, it was time to finish off this last little section of countertop. I just kind of took all my measurements, wrote them on a scrap piece of ply, then went out to the shop and cut it to shape. And again, excessively marked out what material needed to be removed. All right. Okay, yeah, we get it. Then I took that piece of wood and then and it was cut to shape. Carried it back in the laundry room and I slid it in place. This is when I realized that the countertop was going to run into some of the trim around the opening for the door, so we're going to have to make a tiny little notch in the end of the countertop to fit around that trim piece. It was either that or cut the trim piece, and I just thought it would be easier to notch out the whole countertop. So I just kind of eyeballed it, thinking it was going to be close enough, and then I was super surprised when it fit darn perfect. I mean, look at that. Crazy. Now all I had to do was connect my two template pieces together to make them one, and we should be ready to cut out some butcher block. So using just a scrap piece of 3/4 inch ply and some double-sided tape, I stuck it on there so it wouldn't move around, and then I just added some screws. And all of a sudden, two pieces became one.
All right, so we have our templates made, got it fit around the sink very nicely. We're gonna round over those corners so they look a little bit softer. Have a nice seam here. We're gonna do a mitered seam so that the grain kind of flows around the corner. I think that's the right decision. We purposely left a gap at the back here because there's gonna be cabinets set on top of this section of butcher block wall to wall, so you're not gonna see that. And by leaving a gap, we're not gonna be fighting trying to get it perfectly fit along this wall and that wall and our miter. It's just gonna make the installation a little easier. We got a nice tight fit against the trim here because you are gonna see this section from about here forward because the cabinets will stop right there. But now that we've got all of this in here, I'm scratching my head trying to figure out, all right, this is tight wall to wall this way. This is tight on our seam here. If we hook this together with dominoes, my original thought was to bring it in two separate pieces and then we could hook them together. But I'm now realizing there's gonna be no way to get that seam tight with the dominoes together because everything's so tight. So now I'm like, do we hook it all together in one massive piece in the shop and glue it up and then try and carry the entire L-shaped countertop in here and set it in place? But the butcher block is ridiculously heavy, not to mention that's like over 8 feet this way, 7 feet that way. Wrestling that through doorways and paint and all that stuff seems like a nightmare. So I gotta try and come up with a way that we can secure this seam, but we can do it in place that's still going to allow us to slide it together. I don't know what that's gonna look like, but that's the task.
I decided to not actually figure it out at all and just go full steam ahead. I started out by finishing off our templates by rounding off those little corners, and then I was just gonna cut out the butcher blocks, completely abandoning the problem at hand, because sometimes that's just the best thing to do. You gotta get stuff done. Now, I purposely ordered all these butcher blocks oversized because when I ordered them, I hadn't designed the cabinets yet and I wasn't quite sure how much butcher block I needed. So before we start cutting them out with the router, we have to cut away some of the excess fat. So I laid the template on top of the butcher block and just traced the entire thing out with a pencil. And obviously I had to do this with both sections. Not that I needed to show you that, but I'm trying to be consistent here. So I traced out both sections of countertop. Then I just used my track saw and set the track just about a 1/2 inch to 1/4 of an inch off each line, and I cut off all the excess material. Kind of like that. and then I used a jigsaw to cut out the whole sink area. Then we could lay our templates on top and use a router to do our final pass and make sure that the butcher block ends up exactly the same shape as our plywood template. In theory, that is. So I grabbed some more double-sided tape and I put a ridiculous amount on this plywood because I did not want it bouncing around on me when I was trying to cut out all these edges. Then very carefully, using an 1/8" setup block to set it back off that front edge, just because, I don't know why we did this, honestly, we stuck our plywood template onto the butcher block, like this. And then to make sure it was really stuck on there, I walked on top of it, because that's what professional woodworkers do. They stand on stuff. Now we were finally ready to cut out our finished shape of butcher block countertop. So I flipped the entire thing over because I'm going to be using a top mounted bearing bit, and I chalked up a big old bit from Bits and Bits into my big old router, and I started cutting the entire thing in one pass because I'm a moron. I probably should have done 2 passes. I probably shouldn't have taken off so much wood with this bit that's been sitting in my bench for the last 2 years that I've already used and abused. I should have been smarter than that. It's not the bit's fault, it's my fault. And when I rounded the corner, the bit got too hot and overworked and the bearing popped off and I destroyed everything. Here it is in slow motion. Just watch that bearing. Just watch. Just wait. That bearing's gonna go flying right there. And then I drug the entire thing back and just ate away my perfect mitered edge.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
I mean, at least it didn't happen on the most important side of the entire countertop. Ugh. Sometimes, man, things, they're frustrating. The good news is that particular section of the mitered seam will be under cabinets, so whew, you're never even gonna see it. Crisis averted. Then I started doing what I should have done from the beginning, and that was just take off half the material with a shallower cut bit and then finish off the other half after I flip it over. But hindsight's always 20/20. Take this moment to learn from my mistakes and don't be a hero. I did have to switch out the bit for a smaller diameter so I could get in this little notch section on the end of the cabinet that will go around the trim. And then I removed my template and just used the butcher block itself as the template to finish cutting everything off. Then I removed the template on my first countertop. And obviously I had a little pent-up aggression to get rid of. Next, I needed to drill out a hole for our faucet. They don't call it faucets. What do they call them? In the interior designer people, they call them, in a hardware, what do you call it? There's a fancier name than faucet. I feel like fixture. That's the word I'm looking for. I drilled out a hole for the fixture, as the professionals would call it. And then it was time to hook both sections together. I was happy to see that the entire thing looked great, except of course that one part that I really messed up with a router bit. Jason, you're an idiot, but as I said, you're not gonna see that, so just don't focus on that one section just yet. Other than that one section, the miter came together quite nicely, I might say. So with it kind of held together, clamped together, I marked out for some dominoes because, like I said, I'm just going for it. Am I going to be able to get this together when it comes time? I don't know, but we're going to try. And using my patented hip thrust, I mortised out holes for said dominoes. Then I switched the mortising setting to the loose setting, and I did the other side. My thought process being, if the tenon was loose on one side, I'd have a little more wiggle room to get the whole thing to hook together in place. Then I took some dominoes, smeared some glue on them, and I glued them permanently in the tight side of the countertop. Wiped off all the excess glue, and I let those dry. Once they were dry, I tried to hook the whole thing back together, and it did not go. No, I'm just kidding. It went together just fine. Why wouldn't it? That would have been weird. Anyways, now it was time to figure out how to kind of clamp this and hook it together permanently once it's in place. And I decided to use these countertop hardware dealios that I got on Amazon. Basically, it's just a little piece of threaded rod with two little half circle clamps on either end, and it hooks the seam, the countertop. It kind of pushes it, smushes. What it does is it smushes the countertop together, basically, is what this is going to do. And they're pretty easy to install. All you got to do is kind of trace out the general shape and drill 2 holes with a Forstner bit, and then carve out a little connecting path with the router, and you have yourself a little barbell clamping system. You see, it just sits right down in there with the things on either end, and then you add a little nut and squish. The countertop can be clamped together from the bottom, and you're never even gonna know that those things are in there. It is a little hard to get the nuts on, but thankfully I had the world's smallest adjustable wrench to aid me in the process. First time I've ever actually used that wrench, so I was pretty excited. I added one at the front of the seam and one at the back of the seam, and the plan is that I can install these after we get the countertop in place from underneath, and that'll just kind of clamp the whole thing together. Anyways, with the whole countertop hooked together, we flipped it back over again, and I added a nice little 1/8" round over to all my visible edges just to soften them, prevent splinters and make it feel a little nicer on your fingies. And then I sanded down all of the butcher block countertops. And when I say I sanded them down, I mean I delegated that task to Craig because he's my employee and he has to do what I tell him to do. And he has to be happy about it. It's in his job description. After we got everything sanded down, I crawled under the countertop, removed our little barbell clamps, and we separated the 2 pieces. That way we could flip them over upside down and put finish on the bottom of all the butcher blocks. One thing to note about butcher block countertops is once you start cutting into them, you want to get finish on them within the first 48 hours. Because butcher blocks are really prone to wood movement, and if you don't finish them quickly, there's a chance they're going to warp and twist, and nobody wants that. To finish these, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Corn Silk. I went back and forth on what finish to use on the butcher blocks. Ultimately, I wanted something that would be very easy to maintain over the years. And since Rubio is just basically linseed oil, I can put oil on top of oil on top of oil, so it'll be really easy to apply more oil in place. So after finishing all of the bottoms of our countertop pieces and letting that dry for a few hours, we flipped them all over and hooked them back together. I wanted to finish the top hooked together because I didn't want to get finish in that mitered seam. Because once we install it in place, I want to put some glue in there. And if we finish the seam, well, the glue's not going to work very well because the pores are going to be all finished and the glue will have nowhere to absorb into. So it kind of wouldn't work properly. Anywho, with them hooked together, I smeared that Rubio Monocoat on every last inch of the butcher block countertops, easy peasy lemon squeezy, and they were done and ready to be installed. Now, to attach the butcher blocks to the cabinets, I used the domino joiner to mortise out some little recesses, and I'm going to use some Z-clip fasteners to hook them down, because the Z-clips allow the wood to move slightly and not, hurt the countertop or the cabinet, essentially. So we set the countertop in place, and then I crawled underneath, inserted my little Z-clip fasteners into my pre-drilled mortises, and I screwed them to the butcher block countertops. If you would like to purchase these Z-clip fasteners for yourself, I will make sure to include a link down in the video description. Probably should have made this clip shorter because I ran out of things to say about Z-clip fasteners. After we got the butcher block countertop installed, we reinstalled the washer and dryer. Now don't look too closely at these. We didn't spend much time to get them leveled and inserted properly because I really just wanted to get them hooked back up so we could do laundry. We're gonna have to pull them all back out when we paint the cabinets, and then when we put them back in, we'll make sure they're nice and straight and level. So don't judge. This isn't how they're gonna look. Then with that one section of butcher block installed, it was time to move on to the big section. Now I needed to be able to access those little barbell clampy screw things, so I had to cut some access holes in the top of my Lazy Susan cabinet. Then we carried the first section in. This is always a little nerve-wracking because you know your plywood template fits, but up until this point we hadn't tested to see if the butcher block itself would fit. What if something changed? What if something's wrong? What if it doesn't fit? Luckily for us, the first section slid in and fit nice and tight, just like the plywood template. Now for section 2. This was the big question mark. Would we be able to get these two pieces hooked together in this tight space? I spread some glue on our seam with a paintbrush, using just a little bit of glue because we didn't want the squeeze out. And that's when we realized there was no way we were getting this together. The dominoes were too long. So I trimmed them down a little bit. And then just barely, we had just enough room to get those dominoes inserted into those mortises and pop the entire thing together. Then I had the really fun task of sticking my upper body inside the Lazy Susan cabinet and installing our little barbell clampy whatchamacallits to squeeze that seam together and glue everything up nice and tight. Then I added some screws to hook the countertop down to the cabinets on all the other sections, and these countertops were done and installed.
You know, this is the first time I've ever done butcher blocks, and I have to say, I hope it's the last, because these, well, they were a thing, that's for sure. I mean, they weren't too bad. We got them in here in the end, and they look pretty good, minus the one little hiccup in the corner over here. But what would a project be without one major mistake? As I mentioned, there are going to be cabinets that go up on the top, so you're not going to see that. That's why we also left this gap at the back here. But you're going to have to stay tuned for the final video on the laundry room where we build all the upper cabinets, we get all the drawers and door faces in, and we get this whole thing painted. But other than this last little remaining of pink, the laundry room's starting to look pretty good. If you haven't done so already, check the links down below in the video description for all the tools and supplies we used doing these countertops. There's also a link to our Patreon. There's a link to our podcast, Shop Sounds podcast you should be listening to. There's a link to our website where you can get merchandise and all that cool stuff, plans. Until next time, see you later. You guys, it's Monday, and I'm sitting out in the sun enjoying a glass of whiskey. Now you might be saying, Monday? Really? You're already being lazy like that? But here's the beautiful thing. I can be lazy like that because I had set aside this time to work on my website, and because I use Squarespace, I don't have to. It's already done. Because Squarespace makes it incredibly easy to create a professional looking website, and it's not a whole lot of work. It's really that simple. Check this out. I mean, look at this. This is my website, and it doesn't look like some hack job woodworker created it. It looks like it was professionally done. I've got all my products right here, hats, t-shirts, diner mugs. Did you know we sell diner mugs? And then if you click on this button over here, we have all of our plans. Now the cool thing about our plans is that they're digitally downloadable, which means that we don't ship anything out. The website does all the work for us. If you buy a set of our plans, it's automatically sent directly to your inbox, and then you can just download and use them. The other thing I love about Squarespace is they have unlimited amount of products that you can put online, which means that if I come up with 1 million different products, I'm putting 1 million different products up there. You ever wonder how people get those cool web domain names like, hey, coolstuff.com or mellowyellow.org? Yeah, I wondered that too. Did you know that you can actually do all that through Squarespace and they help walk you through the process? So if you don't know how to get your own custom domain, well, Squarespace makes it really simple. So if you're looking to build a website and you don't know where to start, I suggest going to squarespace.com/bourbonmothwoodworking. You're gonna get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain when you use the coupon code bourbonmothwoodworking. So you either go there or just click the link down in the video description. I'll even put it right here on the screen for you to make it real easy. Cheers.